Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tracy McIntyre. I'm the Director of Communications here at the National Museum of Civil War Medicine. Very happy to see you here for our wonderful Saturday afternoon lecture. I would like to introduce Jennifer Ochman. She's a native of the Scranton, Pennsylvania area and attended the University of Scranton. She majored in English and education. She's currently on the board of the Luzerne County Historical Society, and she's a longtime volunteer with the Lackawanna Historical Society, running a Civil War ball in Scranton for that group for the past 17 years. She's also a member of the Confederation of Union Generals and was a member of the Union Patriotic League until its dissolution in 2018. She's been involved in Civil War reenacting and presenting educational performances such as period cooking demonstrations, vintage dances, historic fashion shows, and talks for over 20 years at numerous museums, schools, historical sites, and for various charitable groups. So that's about Jennifer Ochman, but today I would like to introduce you to Miss Louisa May Alcott.
Hello, welcome to the National Museum of Civil War Medicine. My name is Louisa May Alcott, and I'm going to tell you about my life. And if you're wondering why I am here at the National Museum of Civil War Medicine, because most people know me as the author of Little Women, but before I was a best-selling author for children, I was a nurse with the Union Hotel Hospital in Washington City. Now, I'm going to go back and give you my life story, but afterwards, I welcome any questions you may have, and please feel free to come up and take a look at the objects that I've brought with you, and I'll talk a little bit about them at the end. So we'll begin at the beginning, as they say, and go on till we come to the end. So, a lot of people think of Louisa May Alcott. When you think of me, you think of Concord. And that is where I spent a majority of my time, in Concord and in Boston. But I was born in Germantown, Pennsylvania, on November 29th, 1832, the same day that my father, Bronson Alcott, turned 32. So he and I shared a birth date. My father was from a poor Connecticut farm family, and my mother was from a wealthy, influential Boston family. I believe my grandfather was involved with early colonial Boston history. By the time I was 10, we had lived in dozens of places in and around Boston. And the reason for this is that my father was a philosopher and a teacher, but his methods were unusual, to say the least. And if you want to ask me any questions about my father, I can go on at length about his teaching methods. He had a hard time keeping a school, or indeed working at all when I was growing up. He thought of himself as a philosopher. And really, a philosopher is a man up in a balloon with his family and friends holding down the ropes, trying to haul him down. And his head was always in the clouds. My dear mother, Abby, was the ballast to Father's balloon. She kept her feet on the ground and always found ways to keep us fed and clothed, while Father's head was always in the clouds. If you remember reading Little Women, their genteel poverty, the reality was much, much harsher. And we were basically starvation poverty. And his best friend and truest supporter, Mr. Ralph Waldo Emerson, he helped us numerous times with gifts of money and all kinds of manner of support. If it wasn't for Mr. Emerson, I don't know what we would have done. Because my father had all kinds of philosophical ideas, that meant that he didn't really work a whole lot. He had issues with working. So I and my three sisters, Anne, Elizabeth, and May, grew up poor in money, but rich in intellectual surroundings. In addition to Mr. Emerson as a friend and a teacher, we had Mr. Henry David Thoreau. He was our nature studies teacher, sort of nature and science. And the notable author Nathaniel Hawthorne was a neighbor of ours, a little on the odd side, but he did live nearby, along with many other acclaimed thinkers and intellectuals of our day. At one point in our wandering lives, we settled in Concord because that's where Mr. Emerson was, and he wanted Father near him. And their Father was part of the grand transcendentalist movement that swept through that area in the early part of the 19th century. And so it was here we'd keep coming back to, even though we'd move to Boston, we'd move to other little towns around Boston, we'd go to Walpole, New Hampshire, but we'd come back to Concord. So my parents were staunch abolitionists from the get-go, right from the 1830s when they married, even going so far as to harbor an escaped fugitive whom we only knew as John. He wasn't the only fugitive we harbored during my childhood. I taught one man to write on the hearth with charcoal, his big fingers finding pen and pencil unmanageable. My father took me to a rally in Boston in 1850 when I was 18 on behalf of the trial of another fugitive slave. There was this gentleman, his name was Thomas Sims. He had escaped from slavery. I believe he was in South Carolina. He came up to Boston and they found him and they were going to send him back. And when I went there to watch, because my cousin was the lawyer who was arguing for not sending the slave back, I wrote down later in my diary, I said, "I shall be horribly ashamed of my country if this thing happens and the slave is sent back." And unfortunately, he was sent back to his state, despite the vigorous defense of my cousin. And so when war broke out on April 12th in 1861, my family and I thought it was abolition's greatest day. We'd been waiting for this for years. So not only was it a righteous crusade against slavery, but it was exciting to me. I have often longed to see a war, and now I have my wish, I wrote to a friend. Concord was a sight to behold. Everyone wears cockades wherever one can be struck. Flags flap overhead like parti-colored birds of prey. Mr. Emerson's son organized a company of cadets who poke each other's eyes out, bang their heads, and blow themselves up with gunpowder most valiantly. So everyone was getting excited. It was new. It was different. We were happy finally to put this whole thing to rest. And the Concord artillery mustered up in response to President Lincoln's call, and on April 19th, we had a little party to see them off. My father, Mr. Emerson, and some others spoke. A prayer was sent up, and off they went on the train. And I wrote, "A sad day in seeing them off, for in a little town like this, we all seem like one family in times like these." So seeing all this action going on around me, it really saddened me. I didn't like being left behind. My beloved sister Lizzie, who was younger than me, my older sister Annie, then there was me, then my sister Lizzie, and the baby, May. Lizzie had gotten sick, and she had passed away in 1858, and I had nursed her before her death. And I was sort of floundering at this point in my life. I'd had some small successes with writing, and I wanted to continue doing that. I'd seen a little book I'd written for Ellen Emerson. It was Flower Fables. I had it published in 1854, and that was successful. And I was trying to make some other small pieces of writing pay. But now I started to study up on gunshot wounds, and I plotted to get appointed as a nurse. And I felt I longed to be a man, but since I can't be a man, I'll do the next best thing, and I will content myself for working for those who can. I took part in a 2-day marathon at Town Hall, sewing violently on patriotic blue shirts. But really, that wasn't enough for me. So during the first year of the war, all I did was stay home, and I wrote, I read, and I sewed, and I wanted something to do. I took a teaching position because the publisher of the Atlantic magazine rejected one of the stories I'd sent to him and told me I was no good at writing and I should stick to teaching. And he sent me a note with $30 in it and said, "Here, for your school." And that really angered me. So I spent the whole winter teaching, and I made barely any money. I had a little kindergarten school. So I sold a story of mine to the Concord Monitor and made $30, more than I'd made in 4 months of teaching. So why in the world would I teach? I was infuriated that he told me I couldn't write. I won't teach. I can write, and I'll prove it. So after that, I wrote several lurid tales, what I like to call my blood and thunder tales. So I sent them off to Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper. They bought that stuff up and they would buy more of it if I would produce it. So I think my natural ambition is for the lurid style. I indulge in gorgeous fancies and wish that I dared inscribe them on my pages and set them before the public. So a lot of those blood and thunder tales, I would write them either anonymously or I would have a pen name. But Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper ate that stuff up and they would buy as much as I wanted to write. But I think I wrote those sort of stories because I was anxious for an adventure of my own. By early 1862, I was almost 30, and I was kind of still restless. I wanted some kind of adventure of my own before it was too late. So decided to go to Washington as a nurse if I could find a place. I wrote before my 30th birthday in my journal. I love nursing and must let out my pent-up energy in some new way. So Dorothea Dix, the superintendent of the Union Army Nursing Corps, had stipulated that volunteers for nursing be plain-looking. That I could do. I was definitely plain-looking. She said 30 was the minimum age and you had to be married. She didn't want, young ladies going out looking for beaus. But I was not 30 when I applied. By the time I was accepted, I was. But I was not married. But Dorothea Dix had been a teaching assistant at my father's school. He had this, for a very short amount of time, he had this wonderful school called the Temple School in Boston. And she was one of his many associates, his helpers. So since I knew her, I had what you would say today an in. And I got accepted in, I had no trouble getting accepted into the nursing program. So while I waited to be called, I got my things together. Nurses don't need nice things, thank heaven, because I didn't have any. So thank goodness it didn't matter that my stuff was faded and patched and it was hand-me-down. I packed it all up in my trunk. I also sent away another thrilling story. This one was called Pauline's Passion and Punishment. There was a contest in Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper. The first prize would get $100. So I hoped to win that prize. And when I came back from my nursing adventures, I found I had won that first prize. So big feather in my cap and ha-ha to the editor of The Atlantic. So I got my marching orders on December 11th and had to leave for Washington the next morning to report to the Union Hotel Hospital in Georgetown. My family packed me up with all sorts of good things and I was off. When I finally got to Washington City, I found the hospital to be an imposing building with guards at the door and a very trying quantity of men lounging about. My heart beat rather faster than usual, and it struck me that I was very far from home. Now, the Union Hotel had hastily been converted into a hospital. I believe actually it had been shut down as a hotel the year before, so it was sort of left there to rot before they decided that we needed it as a hospital, obviously, because like Frederick, there were so many wounded, all sorts of buildings were being turned into a hospital. So it wasn't a really good building to start with. It was badly lit, crowded, and poorly ventilated. The windows were nailed shut, and whatever panes were smashed had been draped with curtains to keep out the cold. The room I worked in was labeled the ballroom, which wasn't inappropriate if gunshot wounds could christen it. They put me in charge of a ward of 40 soldiers, despite the fact that I had never actually done large-scale nursing before. So my first big test came a few days after the bloody Battle of Fredericksburg. Wounded men started pouring into the hospital. So having a taste for ghastliness, I had rather longed to see the wounded arrive. But when I peeped into the dusky street, lined with what I had innocently called market carts, they weren't market carts, now unloading their sad freight at our door, my ardor experienced a sudden chill, and I indulged in a most unpatriotic wish that I was home again. The men came in and they all had to be tended to. I was so afraid on seeing so many men ragged, gaunt, and pale, with mud to the knees and bloody bandages put on and hadn't been touched since days before. So the matron, Mrs. Ropes, gave me a wash basin, a sponge, and a block of brown soap and requested I begin washing patients as soon as I could. And if she had requested me to shave them all or dance a hornpipe on the stove funnel, I should have been less staggered. You have to imagine I am a 29, 30-year-old woman who has never touched a man's body. So the thought of having to take these men's clothing off and wash them and do this all professionally is really a little overwhelming. But I got through that and much more than that. So the next day, I assisted at amputations. I learned how to dress wounds from a surgeon who seemed to regard a dilapidated body very much as I would have regarded a damaged garment. In moments of calm, I helped the men to write letters home and, take care of them. And that was my favorite part, was to talk to them, make up stories for them, read books to them. And at the beginning of the new year, I wrote home to my family and I said, I never began the year in a stranger place than this. 500 miles from home, alone among strangers, doing painful duties all day long, and leading a life of constant excitement in this great house, surrounded by 300 or 400 men in all stages of suffering, disease, and death. Though often homesick, heartsick, and worn out, I like it. So my day consisted of getting up at 6 a.m. and dressing in the cold of my little tiny room at the top of the hotel in dim lamplight. Once I came downstairs, I would make it a point to open whatever windows were not nailed shut. My father was a huge proponent of the fresh air cure, so we had to get some fresh air into that hotel. It was a perfect pestilence box. And after that came breakfast for the boys. And once I cleared up their breakfast, then the day began in earnest. Washing the patients, sewing bandages, giving medicine, helping the doctors change bandages, and assisting in surgeries. Later in the day, I would find myself trying, sometimes in vain, to obtain supplies and telling orderlies what to do. While I know the work that I was doing was invaluable, I became frustrated with the lack of order at the Union Hotel Hospital. It was not my first choice as a hospital where I wanted to work. I originally wanted to go to the Armory Hospital, but I was not assigned there. So one day on my runs, I would go out during the day when I wasn't working on the nursing floor. I would go for a run and just see what there was to see in Washington City. And I went over to the Armory Hospital, and I found it to be the very opposite of our hospital. Here, order, method, common sense, and liberality reigned. At our hospital, disorder, discomfort, bad management, and no visible head reduced things to a condition which I despair of describing. 6 weeks into this assignment, though, I developed typhoid pneumonia. The same disease eventually would kill our matron, Hannah Ropes. But before she collapsed and died, she sent an urgent telegram back to Concord to my father, requesting that I be taken home immediately. Because I refused to come home, I felt I hadn't done what I was sent there to do. But I was getting sicker and sicker. And after she died, that really scared me. And I thought, I could die here. So when my father seemed to pop up, because I was starting to get out of my head at this point, I let my father take me home. And that was about January 15th of 1863. And it took me until March, really, to start on the road to recovery. Once I regained my health, I was approached by the editors of a weekly anti-slavery paper to make a series from my letters home from my time at the hospital. So thus I came to write hospital sketches, and I have a copy of it over there. The first installment came out in May of 1863 in the Boston Commonwealth. And it was an instant hit, as people were hungry for knowledge of the war. at this point, people still aren't getting a lot of information. They're getting some information out of newspapers, but not an awful lot. And everyone's got a brother, a son, a husband in the hospital. So what's it like in these hospitals? And my lightly fictionalized book really tells them. And I think people loved it because it was truthful and real, despite the fact that I give myself a really ridiculously sounding name. I am Nurse Periwinkle Tribulation. Yes, I was fond of Dickens, and I gave everybody really funny names within the book. But writing this book helped me find my style and my authentic voice, as some authors call it. But I also kept on writing the blood and thunder stories under assumed names to help my family, because my father was rather improvident and could not keep us in money. So I felt this was my way to give back to the family. In 1867, my editor asked me to write a girl's book. I told him I'd try. I didn't really succeed in writing it. I didn't start until 1868, and it took me a while to decide on the plan for the book. I figured I'd model it on my own family, although I wasn't sure who would want to, hear about our silly little adventures. But I said it during our lately finished Civil War. It was published in September of 1868, and I took my editor's advice and retained the copyright. It was a new and unusual business arrangement, but it was the best decision I ever made because it allowed me to take in so much more money. I know people think that ladies shouldn't know about business or do anything with business, but I heartily believe in a woman's right to any branch of labor for which they prove their fitness. Work is such a beautiful and helping thing, and independence so delightful, that I wonder there are any lazy people in the world. So throughout my life, work freely chosen and pursued was the one constant in my life. So when I decided to write the second half of the book is written in two parts. If you've ever read Little Women, you can pretty much see where the break is. The first part, they're young girls. The second part of the book, I pick up the story 3 years later, after the ending of the first. Before the second book was written, people kept writing me and begging me to know who the Little Women marry, as if that is the only end and aim of a woman's life. So I won't marry Jo to Laurie to please anybody. So I made a funny match for her. And the second book was a success, despite the fact that I did not marry Jo to Laurie. From there, my fame as a children's writer really grew. And overall, I wrote over 200 short stories and 41 novels. By the time I took my second European tour in the early 1870s, I had become a very wealthy woman. The first European tour I took, I went as a paid companion to some fussy, sick young woman, which was not fun. But the second time, I paid my own way. So I had a second hit with Little Men, which was published in 1870. People can't get enough of the March family. And by 1870, I was making over $7,000 a year. And that translates into over $2 million by your standards today. So because I grew up poverty poor, I was always worried about our finances. So I'm always putting money aside into what I called the Alcott sinking fund, because it went. My parents had debts up to their eyeballs. So by 1870, I started to realize that I was a very rich woman, and I could finally indulge in my love of fine clothing, and I could keep my beloved Marmee warm and cozy as I had vowed to do for her when I was a teenager. But now, while my fame is building, my little pathetic family is starting to fall apart. Now, my dear sister Anna's husband, John, passed away in 1870 when I was in Europe. I got the news when I came back on the train. And in addition to leaving Nan behind, he also left two little boys, Fred and John. And my dear mother passed away in 1877 after some time of failing health. And she really was the rock of the family. Like I said, she was the ballast holding down father. And I wrote, "Father goes about being restless with his anchor gone." And I found myself at loose ends too, because a great warmth had gone out of life, and for a while I really felt there was no motive to go on without her being there. But during this time, my other sister May was in Europe, learning to be a great artist. And at this point, we had moved out of Orchard House, or as I like to call it, Apple Slump. That's what it looked like to me, into Thoreau's former home. And we all lived there. Nan, my sister Nan, Freddie and John, myself, and Father. And I'm still writing lots of children's stories because I'm always worried there's never going to be enough money. So I'm constantly writing. And at this time, I also decided to take up my mother's cause of women's suffrage in earnest. And in the 1830s, my mother was one of the first activists to call for extending the vote to women. But like a lot of women, we decided that perhaps we would work on abolition first. And once the colored people were emancipated, then perhaps women could follow. So I followed along with the Women's Suffrage Association and the National Women's Suffrage Association. And in our area of New England, the strategy was to start by getting women to be approved to vote in local town meetings. Because we wanted to ask the town to let us vote on issues of children and education. Because even you gentlemen tell us that is what our sphere is. Our sphere is home, our sphere is education, it's children. Well then, why can't we vote and have a say in that? So our state was considering passing the measure in 1877, and my mother was thrilled. Seeing her goal in sight, she told everyone that could listen, "I mean to vote before I die, even if my daughters have to carry me." Now, unfortunately, I would have done it. I would have picked her right up and taken her there. But she passed away before that could happen. So I did the next best thing, and I rallied the women of Concord to register and vote in the next town election. In 1878, I organized reading groups to raise consciousness about the importance of voting, and I circulated petitions to encourage registration. But none of my work helped. I even had the ladies come to the house. They showed little interest in voting. I gave them a good scolding and offered to drive the timid sheep to the fatal spot where they seemed to expect some awful doom. But out of 100 eligible women in town, only 7 did the same as me and voted. And I was the first one to break the ice and actually cast a vote. A very poor record for a town which ought to lead if it really possesses the intelligence claimed of it. Because everyone says, oh, Concord, it's the center of learning. In February of 1878, my little sister May, who's in Europe, she married a Swiss banker in France. My father turned 71, and that summer he finally had his long-held dream of a school of philosophy back at Orchard House, pretty much funded by me. 30 students, Father the Dean. He has his dream realized at last and is in glory with plenty of talk to swim in. People laugh, but will enjoy some new thing in this dull town, and the fresh Westerners will show them that the culture of the world is not in Concord. So I was very happy to see the locals get their comeuppance, but I had little patience really for swarms of budding philosophers. If they were philanthropists, I should enjoy it, but speculation seems a waste of time when there is so much real work crying to be done. Why discuss the unknowable till our poor are fed and the wicked saved, right? In November of 1879, my sister May had a baby girl that she named Louisa, after me. And we immediately nicknamed her Lulu. Now, I had wanted to visit May both before and after the baby came, but I was worried my health wouldn't permit it. I had been sick on and off with various symptoms ever since I got back from my nursing duties in the war. Before the war, I was never ill, but after the war, I was never well. It's just what I gave up in service to the country. And it seems that May had anticipated she might not outlive childbirth. Many women, of course, did not. And her last wishes were that I should take over raising Lulu. So now I see why I lived, to care for May's child and not leave my other sister Annie all alone. So I was going to be a mother at 47, and I waited for the baby to arrive on a steamship. And while I waited, I wrote more stories to bring in more money. And Lulu came, and she made the whole family happy again. And editors would write to me looking for news stories, and I responded that I was busy with baby. I could afford to take off time from writing. In 1881 alone, Roberts Brothers printed almost 35,000 copies of my earlier titles, and in January of that year, they paid me $4,000. So yes, by 1882, I finally began the last story in the March family, Jo's Boys. Again, people really loved hearing about the March family. And I had scarcely begun it when my father suffered a crippling stroke. So he was well one minute and then laid low the next. And by 1885, I found some time to get away because, of course, we were taking care of my father at that point. And I went into Boston. I tried to have some fun. I loved to go to the theater. When I was young, I wanted to be an actress. But my health was not good. When I had the youth, I had no money. Now I have the money, I have no time. And when I get the time, if I ever do, I shall have no health to enjoy it. But I continued to try and write for the children's market. I decided to take some stories that I had invented for little Lulu, and I produced a series of books called Lulu's Library. And I kept plugging away at Jo's Boys. But I was really slowing down by then. In my youth, I'd written Little Women in 3 months, and it took me 7 years to write Jo's Boys. By 1887, I was sick and I was really no longer writing. Whenever I felt better, I would take Lulu out or attend the theater or go to a lecture. In July, I felt I would never get better, and I made my nephew John my legal heir to bequeath my copyrights to. And that fall, I wrote a few more little stories. But by March of 1888, my father was doing very poorly. I had a final visit with him on the 1st of March, and I gave him some flowers. He kissed me and urged me to come with him. We said goodbye, and I knew that it was really going to be our last. And he passed away on the 4th of March. And after that, I did not feel well myself, and I passed away on the morning of March 6th, 1888, just 2 days after my father. And it seems we were destined to celebrate our birthdays and our ending days together. To him, I was duty's faithful child, his famous poem written for me. And I was forever to be seen as the children's friend. In my short lifetime, I managed to write 252 stories and 41 novels. And you can come up and take a look or ask me any questions you might have. I've brought some implements of my writing with me. I have brought a copy of Hospital Sketches. I have brought a copy of Little Women. I have all of my writing with me. These, people always wonder what these are. These were gifts from a dear friend. They are pen wipers. And when you get a lot of ink on your pen, like this poor pen wiper has seen better days, if you have extra ink on your pen, you just dab it off so you don't make big blobs on your letters. And I have brought some patriotic stationery that we used during the war. And my favorite pen, it was a New Year's Day gift from a relative that I got, mother of pearl and gold, and my little traveling inkwell, and some travel pencils and things like that with me, and some letters that friends have written me. And if you have any questions or anything you'd like to ask, I am here. Yes?
Is the hospital in Georgetown, is that building still standing?
No, it was in sad shape in 1861. Like I said, it had been It was closed down because it was so in such poor shape and not maintained. They opened it back up in 1862, and I believe it is no longer there. All right, and nobody has any other questions.
Well, thank you, Miss Alcott.
You're
we really
welcome.
appreciate you telling us the story of your interesting life. I just wanted to remind folks, in the store downstairs, if you're interested, we do have copies of hospital sketches available to purchase if you'd like to follow up and read it. I've read it. It's very interesting. And I want to thank you all for attending today. And if you enjoyed this program, please remember that we are a nonprofit and we are funded mainly by memberships. So if you're interested in taking out a membership, we have brochures at the back of the room. So thank you so much. Appreciate it.
I have one more question.
Yes.
Perhaps you can tell us a little bit about your time and your father's commune you set up.
Oh, Fruitlands. Oh, boy. The best way to learn about Fruitlands is to read my satirical story. It's in Silver Pictures. It is, oh, goodness, I can't remember the title of it right now. It'll come to me. Fruitlands, my father was an idealist. Like I said, he was a philosopher. And by the 1840s, there are all these communes going on. You've heard of Brook Farm or the Oneida Colony or the Shakers. They were communities where you had idealistic rules that you had to live by because you wanted to be a better person. We wanted to bring about peace on earth and all kinds of wonderful things. And the Shakers were not good enough for my father. The Brook Farm was not good enough for my father. He didn't want to join any of these. He wanted to start his own. And so he got Mr. Emerson to help, and I think my uncle May forked over money to buy some farmland in Harvard and a decrepit farmhouse. And he took myself and my sisters and my mother and an Englishman named Charles Lane and Charles Lane's 10-year-old son and a few other oddball people that we picked up along the way to start this ideal community. And we had a lot of rules in this ideal community, such as we would not wear silk because silk was the work of silkworms. We wouldn't wear outfits made out of cotton because it was the work of slaves. So we wore linen because it was a plant. We did not eat plants that grew underground. We did not eat meat, believing that that was bad for your humors and your emotions and things. And so we were trying to live in accordance with the land, and it was extremely impractical. My father would not allow us to use, let's say, he wouldn't allow us to use horses to farm the land because we didn't want to hurt beasts of burden. So, but he would rather go off and philosophize all day over at Brook Farm with Mr. Lane instead of helping us farm, you know. So my mother ended up doing all of the work. We ended up starving. We aren't eating a lot of food because we can't have milk, we can't have sugar, we can't have this, we can't have that. Basically, we're eating apples and bread, I think, is what we were eating. My father thought apples were the nature's perfect food. Which they're lovely, but no one wants to live on them. So the community collapsed. We went out in August, and by December, when the snows started, my mother said, "This is enough for me." And she packed up the children, she packed us all up, and she was going to leave my father because he didn't want to leave. And so eventually they reconciled, but she said, "I'm taking the kids and the furniture and I'm going to go back to civilization. This is not working." And so you can go, I believe, today to Fruitlands. I've not been there. I would like to. Oh, Transcendental Wild Oats is the satirical story that I wrote about it much later in life. But it was, I think, a scarring experience for all of us. And it was the most extreme thing my father had ever thought up. And it's fascinating, but frightening all at the same time. He was a man who really wanted to live by his ideals, such as they were. So yes, certainly a good question. All right. No other questions?
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for